Good morning, afternoon, evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm George Moss here at allpointstv.com, and also 92.1. We are welcoming them aboard again, and we're glad to have them aboard. The Flint Train. This is allpointstv.com. We come together at 2 o'clock, and we stay around to about 3, and we are going to be airing the program on 92.1 at a later date. And we are glad that they are here with us because we need their support and the support of all of the listeners here to keep us attuned to what's going on in the community, and we try to keep you attuned to what's going on here at the studio. And that exchange is keeping us vibrant here and making us excited about coming to you every week, Monday at 2 o'clock to 3. And today we're going to be proceeding the program called Satura's Black History Corner that comes on the second and fourth Mondays, and they start at 3:30 sharp and normally hang around about 30 minutes. And they are bringing their program together to you, getting it ready right now in the studio, and they'll be here in, let's see, about an hour and a half or so, and they'll be right here before the camera. I want to give a shout out to John Wilson, who is one of the technicians here. He does the sound and the light persons. I want to welcome them also to and tell you what a fine job you're doing as well. On 92.1 WFOV, we the sound that comes through the network, and then we have both sound and we have the visual here at the studio, and so the technicians here do a very good job of making sure everything is right before we come before the camera. Our job is very easy. All we have to do is bring our books in here and to try to discuss some of the issues, but the technicians do all of the hard work, and they put things in place to make us look good in front. We never see the person behind the scenes. I think they should come. I think every once in a while, every fourth or fifth program, we should have them come in and put their face on camera so you can see who's making it happen, because I think we take too much of the credit by being in the forefront. But believe me, this studio goes by how well the technicians do their job. And if we did our job and they didn't do their job, you couldn't hear what we're talking about or see us on the camera. Today, I want you to especially read my posts. John was criticizing me for coming in and saying you must have been on Facebook, and I have to admit I'm guilty. I was on Facebook. But I'm trying to clean some things up about all this noise we're making in this country about the Civil War. And I want to, really what I'm trying to do, and I'm not looking for a fight, a battle, a confrontation, but sometimes those things are hoisted on your shoulders and you don't have any choice in the matter but to go out there and try to share some information. I guess you're fighting back in that sense. Or Ishmael Reed saying writing is fighting, so I guess in a sense we're fighting. But we have to make sure that we're operating on correct information. And there's a lot of misinformation that is out there. And I think the politicians, marvel, grovel, would that be a word we can use, in the confusion that's out there. And I think they take full advantage of it by putting these things out here behind doors number 1, 2, and 3. Behind door number 1, they push that envelope there. They push the button in doors 2 and 3. And they are doing conditioned response, where they have us jumping at their command, and we don't see the role they're playing and how they're pushing us up against each other. And they're using this Confederate flag and these Confederate monuments to push us against each other and get us to fighting among ourselves. And all of that is because of the role they're playing. And we saw it particularly to be the case in Charlottesville, because Charlottesville is a very quiet town. About 50,000 people in that town. You never even heard about it, although it has a lot of historical importance in terms of having given the country 3 of its presidents, 2 of them directly from Charlottesville. The other one's about 23 miles away to the northeast of the city. But the 3rd president and the 5th president, Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe, the third and fifth presidents respectively, they came directly out of Charlottesville. And then not too far away from that was the fourth president, James Madison. So that town has a lot of rich history, a lot to be proud of, a lot they could have stoked the fires with in terms of claiming the prominence this city has played in the formative time of this country's history. And you can't do any better than having born Thomas Jefferson, who not only was the third president of the United States, but also was one of the pioneers of the formation of the country, writing the Declaration of Independence, for example. And to then bring out this noise about the Confederacy is just a travesty that we would have that problem. But I want you to look at something that's going on right now as a contrast to it. You know, when the politicians don't get involved, I want you to see what America is really about before the politicians intrude into the space and then create all of this dissidence and have us going to war with each other. Look in Houston, Texas, the fourth largest city in this country, where they have been visited down there with Hurricane Harvey. And it is running its fury. I have friends there, so I know pretty much what's going on because I'm staying in touch with them and worrying about their welfare and the welfare of the others that are there as well. But even people that you don't know in Houston, there are people coming to the rescue of the people in Houston, and they don't even know these people. But what they know about them is that they're Americans. And we are Americans. And what is happening is that Americans are coming to the rescue of other Americans, and they're doing this without any idea of being rewarded for it or even being acknowledged for it. Because that's who we are. That's who we are. We're not interfered with and intruded upon by these politicians. And that's just the way it is. And they get us. Look at the harmony that you see around the country as it relates to this devastation that's taking place as Harvey has wreaked havoc upon the citizens there. I mean, it's unbelievable. And I mean, I'm in the feet of water, and they're saying that the storm is returning back off shores, but before it does that, they're saying it's going to be even more rain, another 2 feet of rain. And so 24 inches of rain, and look what we already had down there. But the Americans stepped up to the plate. One guy, I was reading, one guy is going down to Houston. 90,000 pounds of, they must not know there's some Muslims down there, 90,000 pounds of pork. And he's carrying a barbecue van down there. And they're going to cook up 90,000 pounds of meat, and they're going to dispense that. They raise money to have it paid for, and there's no cost on the part of the people down there. Look at what they're doing down there, and then contrast it with all this nonsense that we have going on in this country, where we get along very well with each other. But we have to understand when we're not getting along with each other very well, what is happening and causing that. And I I wrote on my Facebook wall today. I'm writing this post, by the way. I'm talking about the conflicts in the country. But what I'm doing in talking about that, I am actually using, in this case here, I use Frederick Douglass in this case right here. In this particular part of the writing about what's going on, because Douglass, Frederick Douglass. Now you know Douglass. I think you know several people that were enslaved. People know Douglass, and they know Booker T. Washington. If they don't know anyone else, they may not know some of the others. They might know Harriet Tubman. They might know that name. That comes out quite a bit. They might know Sojourner Truth. But Douglass, of all of the ones that were enslaved that came away from off of the slave plantation and did remarkable things, and there were many of them that did remarkable things. Harriet Jacobs, for example, and wrote her novel. Her not a novel, really. She wrote about her. It was an autobiography. Narratives in Life of a Slave Girl. That's a tremendous book. But I think of all of the writers of the slave experience, I think Douglass is probably the most prominent. And that's because Douglass was a major abolitionist, and also Douglass wrote 3 autobiographical statements. The first one in 1845, where he wrote Narratives in Life of Frederick Douglass. And then 10 years later, in 1855, he wrote My Bondage and My Freedom. And then 3 years before he died, in 1892, he wrote this book called, I have it right here, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. And the reason I'm writing about Douglass in the context of all this noise being made right now about the Confederate, all the flag and the monuments, that we ought to be leaving these monuments alone. Not only because it's part of our history, but because that which they claim that those monuments stand for, that is not correct. They have the wrong view of history, and you're pulling these monuments down because you don't know what really was going on back in that time period. And they have this misrepresentation of the facts of this war, that people are too lazy to go and find out for themselves what this war was about. And so they think that this was about, on the one side, the slavery was on the side, one side was trying to maintain slavery, and the other side was trying to take the slaves away from you got to be kidding me, taking the slavery away from the slave owners. And so one side didn't want slavery, the other side wanted it, and they're fighting over which side is going to come out and prevail. And the North prevailed, and therefore they want to take the slaves off the plantation. That's what they were fighting for, and they have people believing that stuff to be true. And so I'm using Douglass to argue against that proposition, because Douglass, and I brought this book here this is the book by Philip S. Foner, the editor of 5 volumes on the life and writings of Frederick Douglass. This is volume 4 that I brought. But there are 5 volumes, the same thickness as this book is. I'm showing it on the air. This is a very thick book. So Douglass had 3 autobiographical statements in his books. But beyond that, he had a lot of other things that he was writing in terms of the newspapers he had. The North Star in 1847. And then in 1851, he set up the, because a lot of people were calling the paper something about the Star, the North Star, this star, that star. And so Douglass changed the name of the paper to Frederick Douglass paper. And so he has a lot of writings, and to Philip Foner's credit, he edited the writings of Douglass, the voluminous writings in the 2 newspapers that Douglass had. And it's called The Life and Writings of Frederick Douglass. Now, I want to use Douglass as a battering ram against the noise that's being made by all these people out here that are making this noise about the founders, and making this noise about the Constitution, and about the Civil War, and things of that sort. And there has not been a civil war in this country that's actually been fought. There might be one we're trying to inch up toward right now, but that's not a civil war. That was a war of secession, and it's been labeled a civil war, some of which is some of the intent being to hide the real reason why this war was fought. This is not a civil war. A civil war is when 2 different groups, 2 or more groups, are fighting in the same land space to control the particulars of the country they're fighting over. And this is not a civil war. Did you call the war fought between 1776 and 1783? Did you call that a civil war? That war is not called a civil war. It's called the American Revolution. It would have possibly been called a civil war, if that's how you use the term, if the colonists that fought this war had lost, but they did not lose, and therefore it's the American Revolution that was successful in their attempt to succeed from Great Britain, and they did that. This was a secession movement, and this is a secession movement in 1861. The difference is that in 1776, the 7-year war that lasted during that time period, they came out on top. They were able to actually secure what they were fighting for. What they were fighting for was their independence. That is what they're fighting for in 1861. And because it's an independence movement, and because it mimics what had happened before, and they were actually fighting in the name of their the predecessors, the founders, they had to make this something different. Because if you say this is also a war to succeed from the powers that be, then they are within the purview of the framers. That's what the framers were fighting for. So you can't see them in that line of thinking. So therefore, this was a war over slavery, particularly when you see the cost of the war. But this is not a civil war. This is a war of secession, and the same image as the war was they fought in 1776. Now, I want you to go behind me and check this out. Now on my side, as you're checking me out, I do have some pretty good ammunition here, and I think that it could not be better ammunition that I have in terms of the great Frederick Douglass, probably the by some standards, my standards, probably the greatest black son that this country has produced. I think greater than Martin Luther King, because I judge the greatness by not just the heights that you have achieved, but also the depths from which one has come, and further back than Martin Luther King Jr., who was born in a middle-class circumstance, not born in slavery. And I look at his circumstance. King born January 15, 1929. Yeah, 1929. I think Malcolm was born in May. Malcolm was born May the 19th, 1925. I think about that because both King died at 39, and Malcolm X died at 39. So Malcolm was born in 25. I got it right now. King was born in 29. I always like to get those dates right, because if I start quoting things that's not right, my critics will jump on me and say, "You said so and so," and because they check behind me. I want them to check behind me because that makes me better. I have to be on my P's and Q's, and that makes me better. I like the idea of checking, but those two dates are right now. I got them straightened out. Douglass was born in 1818. That's right also. It was first of all thought he was born in 1817, but Douglass was born in 1818. And Douglass, during his 20th year, decides that he has had enough of this enslavement. And so at age 20, Douglass decides to flee the plantation, and he heads north to escape from bondage. Now that would be then, if you say he's born in 1818, then he leaves slavery. He runs from slavery in that means he left in 1838. So in leaving, Douglass didn't leave the plantation like many of them left. He left with a certain amount of skills in reading and writing, and therefore thinking, because if you can read and write, you can think. You can think anyway, but I'm saying you can think on a higher level. And Douglass is quite a thinker by the time he leaves the plantation. He's been thinking about these issues, reading behind people's backs, and had educated himself without even going to school a single day in his life. And I raised a question today in my Facebook post. I was saying, how is it that Frederick Douglass, who never went to school a day in his life, how could he write in 1851, how could he write that the Constitution, his words, the Constitution is an anti-slavery instrument? And I find those words to be very interesting, because he does not say it's an anti-slavery document. I don't think any scholar would have read that and picked that up. Douglass was very particular in the use of his words. He saw the Constitution as an anti-slavery instrument. Very interesting choice of words. And I wanted to read something from the life and writings of Frederick Douglass, the 5-volume work. I'm reading volume 4, some parts of it, that's edited by the scholar Philip S. Foner. And I'm very glad he did this scholarly work, because going back through it, given the discussions now going on in the country, I wanted to use Douglass to, in fact, use Douglass as a part of the firing back at those that really are hiding their contempt for this country under their, I mean, there's a lot of venom out there against this country, and they're using the Confederacy to make the attack. Just like they're using Colin Kaepernick to demand that he play. He must play this season football. He must be on a team. But why are they getting behind Kaepernick? Because Kaepernick is attacking the country. Won't stand up for the flag. Won't show some homage to the national anthem. And they want him playing. Why? They want him out there exhibiting the anti-American sentiment that he exhibits. And I'll say this on this score. I'll say that I was very glad, very proud of the great Jim Brown. Don't get Jim Brown, the football player, mixed up with my favorite entertainer at one time, James Brown. Two different people. James Brown was the one getting on the good foot, and Jim Brown was the one that using both his feet, knocking folks down on the way to the goal line. They couldn't stop this guy, who is the greatest football player of all times, although his stats are not necessarily saying that, because he quit after 12 seasons, because he was a very he was a man that had a lot of pride, and when they ordered him back to get back to the Cleveland Browns at a certain time, and he's making a film at that time, because he had gone into acting and on a part-time basis. Once they ordered him back, then Jim Brown was the kind of person, once you make an order that he has to do something, he's going to do just the opposite. And so Jim Brown shocked everybody at his prime, and quit the football team, stepped down from the NFL. But I'm very proud of him taking a stand against what Kaepernick is doing, and I know all the ones out there don't like Jim Brown now, because Jim Brown came out there and said that I can understand the protest in terms of making a statement away from how he's doing it, but that's my flag and this is my country. And Jim Brown didn't win any friends. I would say no friends on the left for having said that, but I commend them for having said that, because Jim Brown has been a guy that's been upstanding in terms of coming out for political activism in his own right. But he never desecrated the flag. And I give another person a shout out about that too, and that is Shaq. Shaq O'Neal said he could never do that. So everybody wants Kaepernick to play this season, but I'm not fooled by what's going on here. The Confederate flag and all that stuff. All they're doing is using these things to attack this country, and they have to have some umbrella in order to do it. And that's what they're doing, using this as an umbrella to hide the real agenda they have, which is to drive this country down, because in the image of Adam Smith, who wrote in 1776 The Wealth of Nations, and they do not want to have anyone out here talking about the wealth of nations, which is because that's about capitalism, and they want socialism. We're going to take a break right now in terms of the station 92.1. We're glad to have you aboard again. Take a break for 4 minutes and come back, and we'll have you back in that time period.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I would just like to keep people in mind too that they can also not only hear your show and our other shows on our website, allpointstv.com. They can also see it on in a rotational basis. They can see it on Comcast 20, channel 17 on Tuesdays from 8:30 to 9:30. We never know what show it's going to be there because we kind of alternate all the shows. So keep your eye out, and you might see something you are not exposed to, have not been exposed to, and you might enjoy as well. So anyway, I'd just like to encourage to also subscribe to All Points TV on YouTube. That's where you can that's where our shows are at as well. So I like to encourage them also, if they have suggestions or whatever, to contact us through the forum on the on our website. So anyway, I'll turn it back to you then.
Okay, thank you, John, for that announcement. I want to use Douglas in terms of helping to clarify some of the issues here, because Douglas, in the Fredrick Douglass paper, wrote a column in 1851, and he in that column, Douglass had changed his mind. And on this page here, volume 4, page 155 of that volume, he writes, a change of opinion announced. And what Douglass is doing here is changing his opinion about the Constitution being a pro-slavery document. Now, you have to keep in mind that when Douglass came off the plantation in 1838, he was reading and writing, but he wasn't reading on the level of those who had gone to school at that point, because Douglass was just kind of like a neophyte in terms of the literacy aspect of his career. He was literate, but you can imagine that he had not read the classics and things of that sort. Reading on a fairly primordial level, but Douglass over time is going to continue to hone his skills and hone his information, and he's going to get in his own voice. But when he escaped from slavery in 1838, he went to Nantucket, Massachusetts, and there he'll meet a person that was a abolitionist, a white abolitionist by the name of William Lloyd Garrison. And Garrison was one of those persons that was a premier person in the abolitionist movement, probably the greatest of the abolitionists. You had other persons out there, but I think that if you say the word abolitionism in the country and you think about abolitionists, I don't think you think about John Brown, the one that had the revolt, ill-advised revolt in 1859 at Harper's Ferry. I don't think you actually do it that way. A lot of problems there. John Brown martyred himself in 1859, but I don't think that was really the fight, because you have to understand the tools that have to be used given the times. And Brown didn't have it right. Some people have had it better. I cited on radio the other day. I was on a radio show this past weekend. I was citing one of the persons that had it right was Booker T. Washington, and I know that raised a lot of eyebrows. But in Douglass's day and time, the person that had it right in terms of this dispensation of the conditions was Frederick Douglass. And Douglass is going to write about, he changed his mind about the Constitution. We are now going to be welcoming back the people that were listening to the program on 92.1. We're glad to have you back. And we are just now getting into another part of the program that we were talking about, Frederick Douglass. But we haven't said anything that you missed in terms of any of the substance, because we're getting ready to talk about Douglass having changed his mind from seeing the Constitution as a pro-slavery document to now Douglass is saying that he sees it through a different prism, through his own eyes, so to speak, and he sees it now as an anti-slavery, and he doesn't say document. He doesn't use the word document here. He's using a term in terms of the symbol that it represents. And he sees it as an instrument, he says. An anti-slavery instrument. And there's a difference between an anti-slavery document and an anti-slavery instrument. And what is the difference between those two? Let the scholars listen very carefully. An anti-slavery document is one that does not recognize slavery and in fact comes out with in its polemics to in fact disavow it. But the Constitution has states that have slavery being practiced and states that don't have slavery practice. So it is not an anti-slavery document, and Douglas is able to perceive it in that light. But he does recognize something else that's been missed by all the scholars. They've all missed this. They think because it recognizes slavery that it is a pro-slavery document. And that's a mistake that William Lloyd Garrison made, and that's what Douglas is now writing about in terms of how he has changed his mind. Let me read something to you here. This is Douglas now. Never went to school a day in his life. And here is Frederick Douglass. He writes in this part of the Frederick Douglass papers, this is 1851. This is 13 years after Douglass had fled from the plantation. And he's writing about change of opinion announced. Now listen to Douglass in writing this. He says, the debate on the resolution relative to anti-slavery newspapers, which was taken at the annual meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society, assume such a character as to make it our duty to define the position of the North Star in respect to the Constitution of the United States. Now the reason why Douglass feels he has to clarify the position of the paper is because William Lloyd Garrison has said that they will not endorse any newspaper unless the newspaper would in fact avow that it sees the Constitution as a slavery accepting document. In other words, you have to see the Constitution as a slave making document. And Douglass has changed his mind about that. He took that as a view at first because he was accepting the view of Garrison, but now Douglass has read the Constitution for himself and he's changed his mind. So since the American Anti-Slavery Society, headed by Garrison, requires all newspapers that's endorsed by the Anti-Slavery Society to take the position that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, Douglass no longer accepts that. And here's what Douglass said about it. He said, the ground having been distinctly taken that no paper ought to receive the recommendation of the American Anti-Slavery Society that did not assume the Constitution to be a pro-slavery document, we felt in honor bound to announce, listen to this very carefully, at once to our old anti-slavery companions, that's Garrison and others, that and Benjamin Lundy, that they feel honor bound to say that we no longer possess the requisite qualification for their official approval and their commendation. In other words, what Douglass is saying is that if the requirement for the paper to be endorsed by the American Anti-Slavery Society is that they must agree that the Constitution is a pro-slavery document, Douglass is saying that if that is a requirement for the endorsement, he wanted his old friends and his compatriots in the abolition movement, he wanted to know that he's honor bound to say to them that he no longer can accept their support based upon that premise. Why? because Douglas has changed his mind about the Constitution being a pro-slavery document. He now sees it as an anti-slavery instrument. And the difference is that the instrument is like any instrument. Instrument can be used against something. So although what Douglas has seen, and no scholar has seen this, I have not read any scholar who wrote that the document in recognizing slavery is an anti-slavery instrument, meaning that it is a document that stands against slavery, although in recognition of it. And that's a little, it sounds contradictory to say that, because it's a fine tune, it's a fine combing between the two. You parted on this side recognizing slavery. On the other side, though, is the voice that is standing in opposition to it. And the scholars have not been able to see that voice. And I think I can tell you why that is true. I think I can actually say why the scholars have not been able to discern that there is that underlying voice that's underneath the written text. And even some of the written text is that voice. And I think the reason why it's hard to detect that voice is because they see the compromise that were made. But let me ask you something here. When you make a compromise, when a compromise is being made, has the other person changed his mind in total because of the compromise? Or is that person making a compromise in order to get to an agreement, but his viewpoint in the agreement has not changed? He still has the same point of view. But you got to get something done here, and what they want to get done is the bringing of these 13 countries. That's what they are. There are 13 different nations together into the United States. Each of those states is a country, and they want to bring those states together and form the United States. 13 united countries is what it amounts to. The United States of America. They're not merging their independence.
Okay, I'm going to interject here.
Okay.
You bring up about the state. Now, I never heard like saying, and this uses for example, they refer to Israel as not as a country, but as a state of Israel. So I mean, that's like, you're making this. There's a distinction between state and country. Yet they always refer to say Israel. Well, I mean, just maybe it's a side note, and you're also bringing a valid point about the 13 separate nations that were brought together to make one nation, e pluribus unum. But and there's many more aspects to that too, I think, if you flesh it out. But I mean, I just wondered if you could make the distinction between the state.
Yeah, because when you say the state and you mean a country, so you use the word state, small s, small case, and use state also large s. When you have the states, you see, when you see United States of America, they capitalize United States because they're now talking about each of the states being a state. When you talk about them both in the context of being a part of the country, they'll put the states in small case. They'll say the states of the United States. Israel is as the state of Israel, they'll capitalize the word state. You never see that. They'll never say the state of Israel, small case. It'll be the state of Israel, because then you're talking about it as a country. You never see United States, small case, because you're talking about the states as a country for the same reason. And so those states which recognize their independent sovereignty are coming together and they're forming the United States. But you see, if each of those states is not to be capitalized, then it will be United States small case, because the states would be small case. But these states are nations. And whenever you talk about states as a nation, you'll see that S capitalized. That's what you'll see in all those books. You see the state of Israel. There won't be a small s there. The state, small s, will not be there, be a capital S. A capital S would be the way you will present it. If you say the state of Georgia, when I write it myself, I always capitalize it because I'm talking about because I understand the founder's idea of it, I will always capitalize it. But many persons don't. They write it small s, the state of so and so, the state of that. I always capitalize it because I see them in the independence that they were intended to have based upon the framers. And by the way, by them being independent, they were able to make up their own judgment of whether or not they're going to continue to intend themselves as part of the polity. Because they are a state separate from the other 12 states, each one separate, they could then, as a polity, independent polity, they could withdraw their independence from the other 12. And that's what the South is in fact doing. They are withdrawing their statehood. And when they did that, they were then becoming a state again until they're associated inside the Confederacy. And so the Confederate states, and you see that capitalized. The small s only indicates part of a polity bigger than the individual state is. So a state of America would be small case. They were small case that statement. Because they are large, because they're talking about it in part of a larger polity. Although when I write it, you see my writings on Facebook, I always capitalize it.
Yeah, I thought that was a point too, because you know you have many viewers or listeners now that might not actually. This might be an introduction in a way to them to the political science, political sciences or civics. So I mean, I would like to, that's I just want to make sure that distinction is made.
Yeah, it's a very interesting distinction, John. I'm glad you brought that up. We have to understand our history a little bit better than we do. And if we don't, then we're going to have these persons coming here parting the waters, meaning that they're parting us on one side of the divide, and on the other side they're dividing us. When we are able to be Americans, we're not divided. And I was saying earlier, that's what you see now. I'm very happy that we've come together. I'm not happy about the circumstances in which we came together, but I'm very happy to see the American people rising up to do what they always do. When there's not any people getting between us, we are like this. In fact, let me say what I said on radio the other day. I was on radio and I was stating something I just read. I just read this this interview that was done 6 months before W.E.B. Du Bois died. It was an interview done by the editor and publisher of the Atlanta Constitution. He went over to Accra to interview W.E.B. Du Bois. William Edward Burkhardt Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois. They call him W.E.B. because they long name and they just shortened it by W.E.B. William Edward Burkhardt Du Bois, the great Du Bois. But Du Bois is in Accra, and in an interview that he did 6 months before he died, Du Bois died August the 27th, 1963. 6 months before his death, he did an interview. And the person that interviewed him wanted to talk about the rift between him and the great Booker T. Washington. See, I see both of them as great. Some see them either or. I see them both as great. And Du Bois tells the interviewer, he said that he was told, Du Bois was told, that when Booker T. Washington gave his speech in Atlanta, which Du Bois called the Atlanta Compromise, he was saying that Washington had sold out. But he said that a person that was there told him that when Booker T. Washington said, in all things, and by the way, his speech was given September the 18th, 1895, Booker T. Washington said, in all things that are purely social. They said Washington held up both hands like this. And for those on radio, I'm holding my hands up, both hands facing the camera. He said, in all things purely social, holding his hands up, we can be, and he had his fingers stretched out, he said, we can be separate as the fingers on the hands. And then the person told Du Bois, and Du Bois is telling his interviewer, Washington then closed his hands and then did this, meaning he claps his hands together and said, in all things involving mutual progress. I would say progress, but Washington's tone was progress. In all things involving mutual progress between blacks and whites, we can be one as a hand. And that was a speech that Washington gave in 1995, and they can call it anything they want to. The Atlanta Compromise, or saying he was selling out and things like that, so his critics were saying that. Critics consisted of Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter and Alexander Cromwell and some of the others, Ida B. Wells, Barnett, later on when she married the judge, Ferdinand Barnett, and other critics of his that knew better than what Washington knew, but had not built a school like Washington built. Washington was getting things done, and you could not do it in the voice in which those others were speaking. And what did they get done? Du Bois didn't build a school because you could not do that under those terms because you would not be financed. And Washington understood the tone that he had to be in, and he did what he did based upon the circumstance, and he was able to get a victory out of it. And that has been credited at some point when they understand history better than they understand it right now. Douglas is not understood either. And Douglas has changed his mind because Douglas finally did what any scholar would do. Douglas finally read the document for himself. You can tell people, you see, you can tell scholars something for a period of time, but the real scholar will go behind that and research it for himself or herself. There's a book out that I have a lot of respect for that did just that. A guy, Robert C. Smith, wrote a book called, let's see, Robert C. Smith's book. I'll think of it just a minute, but he's a, his book is called We Have No Leaders. We Have No Leaders, meaning blacks. We Have No Leaders. And Robert C. Smith wrote that book only after he had gone, first of all, he heard one of the speakers that came to his school, at that time he was at Prairie View, down in Texas, by the way. And he heard Harold Cruz came to his college to speak, and Cruz said that a person asked Cruz a question, and the question was, what did he think about black leaders? And I think Cruz must have answered the same way that James Baldwin answered when I asked that question of James Baldwin back in 1970 or 71. I asked that question to James Baldwin, the writer of The Fire Next Time and Nobody Knows My Name, Another Country, Your Beale Street Could Talk, and other books like that. And I asked James Baldwin that question. I mean, I must have sounded like a child to James Baldwin. And I asked him what did he think about black leadership. And Baldwin lectured me like I was a child. He asked me, he talked to me in a tone of voice. He said, are you kidding? Are you kidding? He said, there's no black leadership. But understand, I'm saying this to you and not the New York Times. So, I mean, I understood what he was saying. He's not shouting it, but we're having a private conversation. I understood that. And that's what he answered. Well, down at Prairie View, Robert C. Smith was a faculty member at Prairie View at that time, and he was in the audience when students stood up and asked him about asking that same question. What do you think about black leaders? And they went down this one. He's the head of this organization. That one, the head of this organization. And you know, Harold Cruz was quite a scholar. He didn't have a degree, but he was quite a scholar. His book called Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, which was written in 1967. That is almost like a philosophical Bible. That book, I don't think anybody has topped that book, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And when Cruz on the anniversary, one of the anniversaries of that book, was asked if he would go back to the book and if he would change anything, and Cruz said no, that it reads as it was written, and that he would not change a single word in the book because that book was really written on a higher level. And so anyway, when Cruz is in that auditorium speaking before the student body, they asked him this question about what he thought about black leaders, and Cruz was the kind of person very impatient when he would listen to what he thought would be noise, and everything to Cruz was noise because Cruz was the kind of person that he was so far above most person he would encounter, including scholars on these college campuses, that he just was very intemperate and very impatient with people when they were just simply spouting off what Cruz thought was nonsense. So they talked about this one and that one, this organization and that organization. And Cruz waved them quiet with his hand, just, kind of like a shut up move. Shut up. He wasn't saying any words, just simply, being exasperated. Get out of here with that. And he said that there are no black leaders because none of them have any communitarian understanding and any communitarian answers to the communitarian problems facing the black community. In other words, leadership is not being on the microphone, being on the mic. You can be on the mic rapping, for example. And so he didn't consider them to be leaders. He just saw them as people up there, talking over a microphone. That's not leadership. Leadership is a person that has a plan. It goes even beyond having a dream. The question is, you have a dream. That's fine. What's the plan? And I don't think it's any different than this other book that's written about the same idea. This book called by Bunny Allen. We have her book is called not We Shall Overcome, but We Have Overcome. And in her book, she writes about the 5 myths about black leadership, and that is myth number 2, the myth that black people need to be led. If they have to be led, why? So this idea, I'm coming back to my basic point here. This idea, there's some problems here with the way we look at things that have been passed down for a period of time, one of which is black leadership. The other one is about this Constitution that we have here. Douglas was right in how he saw it. I see it the same way. And I read the same way Douglas read it. And that is that it is an instrument. It is an anti-slavery instrument. He did not call it an anti-slavery document. He was too prescient for that. Douglas was too scholarly. Never went to school. But some of it is that you're interfered with by what you learn. A lot of education, by the way, is what you get rid of. You have to you take things in, and you have to also dispense and discard some things that you've taken in. Douglas did not have that much to discard because he had not been sitting in a building for 12 years. He was doing his own scholarly work. So he didn't have to dispossess himself of as much of the baggage as many of us do. And some of us never get over it. Douglas had changed his mind about the Constitution. And he says here that he could no longer accept the endorsement of the American Anti-Slavery Society because the endorsement required those persons being endorsed, those papers being endorsed, it required them to agree that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, and Douglas does not agree with that anymore. He met Garrison in 41. So from 41 to 51, that's 10 years. For a decade, Douglas went along with that. But in 1851, Douglas has here a change of opinion announced. And you can read it in the book, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. He wrote it in that book as well. He changed his mind. In 1855, in his book called My Bondage and My Freedom, he writes it there. And I brought this other book here. This is written by David Barton, a scholar, who wrote a book called American History in Black and White. David Barton is a white author who wrote about black history and wrote this about Douglas. He says here, during Douglas's first years of freedom, he studied at the feet of abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who taught him that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Douglas accepted this claim, and his early speeches and writings reflected this belief. However, Douglas later began to research the subject for himself. He read the Constitution. He read the writings of those who wrote the Constitution, and what he found revolutionized his thinking. He concluded that the Constitution was not a pro-slavery document, But in anti-slavery, and he used the word document, but document is not the word used by Douglas. Douglas uses another word. He uses instrument. An instrument. Now, Barton is a scholar, and I give him a lot of credit for what he did here in his book. But Barton makes the same mistake that a lot of people would make. They have to pay attention to the use of words. Words are important. How they're used how words are used is important. And document and instrument are two different ways of describing the Constitution. It is not an anti-slavery document. It's an anti-slavery instrument. And if you go read his tenets, everything in the Constitution is there restraining and restricting slavery. So it's an instrument to eventually blow the candle out of slavery. And if we understood that, it would eventually go out on its own. It would have gone out on its own at that time period because of the fact that it was ended. And what ended slavery, by the way, was not the Emancipation Proclamation. Slavery was ended in this country by capitalism. That's what ended it. And Adam Smith, you are the one to take a bow for that, because that is ultimately what played out in the 1860s. Okay, we got to get out of here. Want to thank you again for tuning in. Want to thank allpointstv.com for hosting the program, and 92.1 want to thank you for joining us, and we will see you again next week at the same time. Until that time, I want you to follow your dream, because if you don't follow your dream, you'll never know what's on the other side of the rainbow.